If you were to be asked, or if your neighbors were to be asked about you and what kind of neighbor that you are, what do you think they'd say? What's the impression that we're giving to those that live in our neighborhood about our love for them? Because according to the Bible, we ought to be the best neighbors that there are. Did you know that where we live isn't a place that we live by accident? We don't live where we live by accident. Listen to what Acts 17, 26 and 27 says. It's something that the Apostle Paul said. It was said in the context of him preaching at a place in Athens, Greece called the Areopagus. The Areopagus is a place that neighbors from the city of Athens would come together and they would debate. They would talk about religion. They would talk about the various gods. They would talk about the pantheon of gods. You know, if you've taken any Greek mythology or you've taken any kind of historical Greek classes throughout the years, that the Greeks worshipped a whole lot of gods. And they wanted to be sure that they didn't mess up. And so at the Areopagus, they even had an altar to the unknown God. And Paul took it upon himself to use the altar that the people of Athens had created to the unknown God to begin to build a bridge to the gospel with the people of Athens. He saw that as an opportunity to begin to describe to them who God was. And so he began to speak eloquently about God in Acts 17, being the creator and the sustainer of life. And he spoke eloquently about the sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God means that God is in control. God absolutely knows the future. We have a God who the future is not a mystery to. His sovereignty even extends to where we live in the neighborhoods that we live in. Many of you know I'm a very, very part-time realtor. I sell 3 or 4 houses a year to former students or family members, and my clients will oftentimes tell me about the things that they want in a home. They'll say, hey, here's the deal. We want this type of neighborhood. We want this type of home. We want this many rooms. We want this many square footage. We'd really like stainless steel appliances, or we'd like a ranch, or we'd like and they'll just go on and on and on telling me about everything that they want in their home. But I have yet to have somebody tell me in the entire time that I've shown people homes, and this is who I want my neighbors to be. And in fact, very few people, when we're looking at homes, will even knock on the neighbor's door to find out who the neighbors are. This is how Paul talks about the neighborhoods that we live in. From one man, he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. God has placed us in our specific neighborhoods for a reason. Now again, that may be for a set period of time for you. Some of you have moved recently. Some of you will be moving in the near future. But wherever it is that God places you, he's placed you there for a reason. It blows me away that God has determined that. A few years ago, we thought that we were going to be moving here to Woodbury, and God kept us in Eden Prairie, and I was a little upset about that. So Lord, come on, why? Why didn't that work out? But God has a reason that he's kept us on Chesholm Lane in Eden Prairie. God has placed you in your neighborhood for a reason. Your neighborhood might be an apartment in the city. It might be a single-family home in a bustling neighborhood, a farmhouse on many acres separating you from your nearest neighbor. Your neighborhood, for some of you, in the next few months is going to be a college dorm with a crazy roommate and crazy people down the hall. For others of you, your neighborhood is a retirement community, and you just kind of feel like you're back in college again, just with people with gray hair instead of long hair or whatever. I don't know. But you've got a neighborhood, and whatever that situation is that God has placed you there. Think about that for a second. God placed you there. We need to recover a theology of place. We need to begin to really love where we live. And by that, I mean we need to love our neighbors. You're living in your neighborhood as an ambassador for Jesus Christ. In our School of Discipleship, we read a book, and then one of our women's Bible studies here read the same book, a book called 11 Indispensable Relationships You Can't Be Without. It's a book by Len Sweet. If you've never read this book, I want to encourage you, pick it up. It is one of these great books, and And what I love about the book is it talks about relationships that we need. We need butt kickers in our life. Somebody who's just going to say, hey, you know what? You need to get your act together. We need accountability partners. We need people who are going to be our cheerleaders and encouragers. We need people who are just going to be our best friends, that close circle. And it talks about the different types of relationships that everybody needs in life. But one of the relationships that he speaks about there is that we all need a place. And that kind of threw some of the people in our school for discipleship for a loop, because they said, well, that's not a person, it's a place. And I remember one of the people in particular said, I really, really wrestled with what's my place? Where's my place? I didn't really feel like that was my neighborhood. And they determined my place is Woodbury Community. I love this place. I love these people, and that's part of my neighborhood. And while that is good, we also need to love our neighborhood. We need to love the place that God has put us. The theology of place means that we recognize God's sovereignty in placing us in those areas where our natural relationships are. So yeah, that's your church. Yeah, that's your neighborhood. Yeah, that's the place that you work. Yeah, that's the family that God has placed you in. We need to love our neighbors as Christ called us to love. So when I get to sell a house to a Christian individual or couple, I love it. I love getting to shop with people that I know are followers of Jesus. Because we'll do something on the final walkthrough. We'll get to the neighborhood, they pick their spot, I'll talk to them about kind of where God's putting them throughout that. But when we get to the final walkthrough, and we're going to go to closing later on, we'll just stop in the house before we move to closing. And we just have this time of prayer with that individual or the couple. I did this just a few weeks ago with a young single adult guy that was one of my former students. And Ryan and I just sat in his little townhouse that he bought in Chanhassen. We prayed, God, you've brought Ryan to this neighborhood. And Lord, Ryan's your child. And as your child, that means that he is salt and he is light in this generation. And God, I just pray that you would bless him in this house. And I pray, Lord, that you would use him to be salt and light, to get to know his neighbors, to get to love his neighbors, to get to be somebody who in this neighborhood you're going to use for your glory. A couple of stories from the past few years. I love the couple on the top left, Johnny and Sydney. Johnny was one of my students at Wooddale, and Johnny works down at Thomson Reuters where my son Chris works, and he serves in the military, and he just had a 12-month deployment not long after moving into this home. But as they were looking for their home in Richfield, they just prayed, God, show us where you want us to be. And we got there and we prayed before their closing and said, God, just use these two. And as we prayed, and even in the weeks before, as we talked about where God was placing them, they said, you know what? This heartbeat and this passion for the neighborhood, we just feel like we need to find a church in our neighborhood where we can invite friends to, where we can invite, and they have connected so well. They have visited like every one of their neighbors and brought them treats and just invited them to do life with them. Sydney is walking almost every day with, when Johnny was on deployment, with one of the other young moms in the neighborhood, and she's done some Bible studies, and it's just so cool. They understand that where God has placed them, he has placed them for a reason. Chris and Sam, my son and daughter-in-law, bought a house this year. And on vacation, Samantha was telling me about some of the stuff that they've done. And Chris is a little bit more like me. He doesn't like going out and meeting like the neighbors. Anybody relate to that? Like you're an introvert, and so even talking about like meeting the neighbors, that's a hard thing. And Samantha's more like my wife. She's like, let's go meet the neighbors and let's go bring. So Chris and Sam moved to their little place in South St. Paul, and Samantha, like in the first weekend, is baking cookies for all the neighbors. And she's like, come on, Chris, we're going to go meet the neighbors. And he's following behind her like his dad does with his mom. And he's like, oh, great, and they're knocking on doors. And Chris is relieved every time somebody doesn't answer the door. And Samantha's just bummed when they don't answer the door. And one of the people, she knocked on the door, and they're like, we don't want anything, And she says, we're not salespeople. We're just here to bring you cookies. We're the new neighbor. And, kind of leave it at the door kind of thing. I mean, it was just so cool that she had that passion naturally to just go and meet the neighbors. And over vacation, she was telling me about the way that God is already beginning to give her opportunities to be Christ to her older senior citizen neighbors, totally different stage of life. She says, I love going outside and talking to my neighbors who didn't want to open the door because I was a salesperson, and just getting to do life with them. I love that. And I got to be honest with you, I am not as good at my daughter-in-law. I'm the pastor, she's the extrovert, and she gets it. Neighboring hasn't always been an easy thing for me. Like many Minnesotans, I value my free time. I really love the winter when I'm not expected to be outside and I can just open the garage door and pull in and close the door and not have to talk to anybody. And but what God has convicted me on over and over again is I can't say what I say to my clients. I can't say what I say to the people in my church and not live what it is that God has called me to live. I need to be somebody like who makes this theology of place something that not only that I'm living and demonstrating and championing, but that I'm doing that because of a sincere love for people. Last year, our elder board met, and they began to think about priorities for 2017. At our elder board, if you were at our annual meeting, there were two really big priorities that came out. One of them had to do with structures at Woodbury Community Church, and our staff has been working hard on some structural changes for this year and our leadership team, and I can't wait to share some of those changes with you in the coming week. But the other thing that our elder board said we want to focus on this year is on helping and equipping our congregation to be able to share the gospel in the year 2017. See, we believe that culture is changing, but the gospel doesn't change. And because culture is changing, we need to find ways to articulate that the great news of the gospel of Jesus Christ with our neighbors. There's an awareness that we as a church need to do a better job of fulfilling the Great Commandment and the Great Commission that Jesus Christ gave to us. The Great Commandment being to love the Lord our God with all of our mind, soul, our strength, our heart, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. And the Great Commission being to go into all the world and to make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey everything that Jesus Christ has commanded us. These two great priorities of Jesus, the Great Commission and the Great Commandment, are absolutely intertwined. The disciple-making process that we're so excited about as a church begins with evangelism. Begins with reaching people who don't know Jesus. You can't grow if you don't have a relationship with him. Proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ is one of the most important things that we can devote ourselves to. And we live in a world where even the freedom to do that is being taken away little by little. And we're going to talk about that. And so how do we articulate that in a culture that is becoming increasingly hostile? Over the next 6 weeks, we're going to look at some practical ways that we can love our neighbors. We're also going to look at practical ways that we can articulate the gospel. We're going to make sure that as a church we understand what is the gospel and how do we share that. This is how Jesus put the Great Commandment in Matthew 22, 34 to 40. Many of you have devoted much time to this passage. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment of the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the law and the prophets. And many of you, because of the Great Commandment, have been found as saying, hey, we need to love God and we need to love others. That is what Jesus Christ has called us to do. And that is absolutely right. But he's also called us to go further. Look at the Great Commission in Matthew 28, 18 to 20. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I'm with you always to the very end of the age. Rick Warren, years ago in his book, The Purpose-Driven Church, wrote something that I love. He said, a great commitment to the Great Commandment and the Great Commission will build a great church. And I believe that. And I'm not talking, when Rick says that, about just one local church here. But that if the Church of Jesus Christ, that church that meets all over Woodbury and all over the Twin Cities and all over the world, the people of God who are coming together today, if we will get serious about the Great Commission and the Great Commandment, then a church whose light has been a bit dim in recent years, at least here in North America, we will shine bright. But we've got to be committed to the priorities of Jesus. When I was at Maranatha last week, I was so blessed by the missionaries who were there. The Slavic Gospel Association was our missionary for the week, and we had a bunch of missionaries from Slavic Gospel. We had the founder's daughter who's 90-some years old, and she would get up and speak, and she would hop out of her chair as a 90-year-old woman, and she had more energy and more passion as she would tell these stories about the way that God has worked in the former Soviet bloc. And I can't wait to tell you some of the stories that she told us over the past week. We had the new president and the former president, but my favorite person who was there from Slavic Gospel was a missionary who didn't speak English. He was from Ukraine, and he's serving in Tajikistan. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but Tajikistan, when I think of countries in the world, isn't the place that I think about going to travel. It's not the place that it's on my vacation destination list. I don't think I had thought about the country of Tajikistan other than when I hear it announced in the Olympics, like when they're announcing the different nations of the world. There's 8 million people who live in Tajikistan, 2,000 evangelical Christians in the entire nation. Think about that. The nation is 99% Muslim. If you go on the actual government site, they say it's like 95% Muslim because they want to appear to be more accepting of other religions. They said, but the fact of the matter is that is not true. 99% Muslim. They share like a 800-mile border with Afghanistan. And you can see they've got some very interesting neighbors in Tajikistan. And this young missionary, maybe mid-30s, talked about the cost of following Jesus in his country. For him to love his neighbors means that his family has gone through incredible persecution. Even that week, the camp director said, would several of you after this session just surround our missionary brother's wife because one of her family members is imprisoned right now and is being beaten for their faith. I mean, this is the price that they had to pay. One of the things he said that just kind of shook me to the core was that Tajikistan passed a resolution recently that is being passed in countries all over the world. And it's being passed, they said, because of radical Islam. And so it's been passed to maybe stop some of the horrible abuses that are happening to children in radical Islamic camps. But the law is simply this, that it is illegal to share the gospel, to proselytize, to give any religious instruction to children under the age of 18. But it's also illegal to proselytize your neighbors. And so if you're caught sharing, and it's also illegal to, and so there are all these restrictions that have been put upon the church in Tajikistan, and despite that, it's actually thriving. That 2,000 believers is an exponential growth from where they were just a few years ago because of some courageous people that have said, hey, we're going to stand for the gospel of Jesus Christ. My brother in the Lord talked about last week his deep and abiding love for those in his neighborhood. He is a man who has placed God's priorities above his own comfort. And I wonder how we're doing there. In Luke 10, 25 to 37, Jesus told a story that illustrated the Great Commandment in a beautiful way. Listen to how that story begins. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You've answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. And I want the story to end there so bad. But it doesn't. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? The lawyer started out so well. What do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Jesus turns the question back around. He answers, hey, I think I'm just supposed to love the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, and strength, love my neighbor as myself. Jesus is like, bingo, you got it. That's exactly how I answer that question. You're doing so well. He commends the man, and then the man wants to justify himself, and he wants to kind of choose who his neighbor is. Many people try to justify themselves by defining neighbors as someone that we can choose to care for, that we can choose to care for. We want to love those who are convenient for us to love. We want to choose who gets to receive our love. We excuse ourselves from reaching out to others with arguments like, I only have so many relational blocks in my life. We had a guest speaker here several years ago who is a phenomenal preacher and pastor and leader of men. And he got up and he talked about the challenge in suburban America and the church is growing. And he used some Lego blocks and he says, see these Lego blocks? There's only so many blocks and spaces in a block that will fit. And so an sided or an pegged block is going to fit an 8 pegged Lego, and there's no more space. And we're kind of like that Lego. We only have so much relational space in our life. And I liked that illustration, but sometimes that illustration can be an excuse. It can become an excuse that says, I just don't have time to love more people in my life. Or I'm involved in so many things. Or I'm so busy, or my kids are so busy, I just don't have time to love my neighbors. But what if Jesus meant when he said in the Great Commission that we're supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves, that he meant that we're actually supposed to love our actual, real neighbors? Like the people who live in our neighborhood. What if that's where we're supposed to start? So Jesus showed the man what loving his neighbor was all about by telling a parable. Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest who was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was. And when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and he bound his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set on him his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of whatever of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, you go and do likewise. The Samaritan in the story met the physical, material, financial, and emotional needs of the man in his path. Now, we've studied the Good Samaritan like 2 times in the last year. Drew Madison preached a great sermon on this, and then I preached a message on this when we were studying Luke. I'm not going to go into great detail on the parable today, but you remember that to a Jew, a Samaritan may as well have been a terrorist. These were the enemies of the Jewish people. To be a Samaritan was something that to the Jewish people was considered to be a scourge, and to love a Samaritan would have been unimaginable, and to consider that a Samaritan might have mercy on you as a Jewish person would have been unimaginable. Jesus showed that our neighbors are much more than the people who live in our block. They're much more than the people whose kids are on our kids' sports teams or students in our classrooms. They're much more than the people that we share an office with or the family members that we have. Neighbors in the eyes of God, he shows us over and over again, are everyone on the face of the earth. You want to know your neighbors? Your neighbor's the Palestinian. Your neighbor's the ISIS terrorist. Your neighbor's the next door neighbor. But I like what Jay and Dave, the pastors who you saw in that video, have written in this great book, The Art of Neighboring. And this is a book, again, that's being used by churches all over the country right now. They say this: as we read this parable 2,000 years later, it's tempting to turn the story of the Good Samaritan into a metaphor. If we're not careful, we can become numb to the power of the Great Commandment. If we say everyone is my neighbor, it can become an excuse for avoiding the implications of following the Great Commandments. Our neighbors become defined in the broadest of terms. They're the people across town, the people who are helped by the organizations that receive our donations, and the people whom the government helps. We don't have to feel guilty, we tell ourselves. After all, we can't be expected to really love everybody, can we? The problem is, however, that that when we aim for everything, we hit nothing. So when we insist that we're neighbors with everybody, often we end up being neighbors with nobody. That's human nature. We become like the lawyer looking for a loophole. Jesus says that your enemy should be your neighbor. He says that you should go out of your way to be the neighbor of someone who comes from a place of history of open hostility toward you and toward your way of life. Clearly, he's stretching our understanding of what it means to love. We would define this kind of love as advanced or graduate level love. The reality is that most of us aren't at graduate level. We need to start with the basics. We need to start by going back to kindergarten and think about our literal neighbors before we attempt to love everyone else on the face of the planet. How can we begin, for example, to care for a wounded terrorist if we haven't reached out to our neighbors? So let's start by learning our neighbors' names. So I want to make today really personal for us. When you arrived, you were given a piece of paper that looked like this, and I want you to pull that out if you haven't. Maybe there wasn't enough for everyone. I hope you all got one. We're going to go back to that kindergarten level that they talked about. And we're going to make this really easy for you. The house at the center of this little tic-tac-toe looking diagram is your house, okay? So if you know the names of the people who live at your house, congratulations. I'm proud of you. I hope that that's the case. The other 8 houses represent the 8 homes or households that are closest to the home that you live in. And again, I recognize that not everybody lives in a neighborhood that looks like a tic-tac-toe board. I don't think most of us do. So I want you to think, who are the neighbors who live closest to me? I think about people like the Havemans who live in a barn, a farm, and have acreage in between. I don't even know how you'd figure out the 8 neighbors closest to them, but they do have 8 neighbors that are closest. So I want you to think about those neighbors. Think about the homes. And I want you to just take a moment to try to write down the names of the people who live in those houses. So take 2 minutes, all right? 2 minutes is all I'm going to give you to write down the names of the people who live in the 8 houses closest to you. And it's okay if you and your spouse have a disagreement on what those 8 houses are, okay? Because I know Cindy and I are not going to agree on the 8 houses closest to us. I have one way of looking at it, and I guarantee you, we haven't talked about it, she will have a different way of looking at this, okay? So try your best to come up with that. Okay, so I totally threw my wife under the bus there. She said, come on down here, I want to see your papers. She was smart and already did this, like so many others of you probably did as you were watching the video. And I'm happy to report that we are not as messed up as we think. We actually had all the same neighbors, just in a different order in the back. I was right. She was wrong, all right? So that's the way that it goes. All right, I got a question for you, all right? And I'm not going to tell you yet how many I got. How many of you were able to get at least 5 of the neighbors' names there, all right? Holy cow. You guys are amazing neighbors, all right? That is by far, like 5 of the houses, or you got 5 names? How about 5 houses, 5 households? All right, that went down a little bit. Some of you were like, yeah, I know all 5 of the neighbors that live right next door to me. Okay, so, but still, fantastic. Here's what the statistics tell us about kind of how people do in this. Only about 10% of people can fill out the names of all 8 of their neighbors. And so Joan I saw Joan, she's got it down, right? Joan, you had all 8? Yeah, and that does not surprise me. She is a people person, and I was at her house for the 4th of July, and she tells me who all her neighbors are, and I meet half of them when we're there. All right, I'm not really great at this. I'm going to tell you right now, your pastor has some room to grow here, and this is an area that I want to grow in. So as I fill out this sheet, I have Russian family right here. I don't know their names, all right? That's not really good. And they've lived in my neighborhood for a long time. I know she teaches at the high school. I know that, but that's what I have. Okay, I've got the guy across the street down. That's Dave, and his wife was Carol Ann, and she passed away a few years ago. I have Mike. Cindy didn't have Mike. Neither one of us have his wife, though, all right? And Mike comes and talks to me, and he's trying to convert me to Catholicism, and I keep telling him that's not going to happen, but he gave me a book to read not long ago that he wants to discuss with me this summer. And then Terry and Denise are right next door, and we are close. I had their kids in my youth ministry, and I love them. We went to the same church, and then Ron and Barb are on the other side, and they're this wonderful Catholic family with 6 kids who were all living at home when we moved to that neighborhood, and we got to know all their kids. And then I've got the older guy with dogs in the corner here, all right? So obviously don't know his name. And then I've got Mike and Camille and Donovan and Cindy had their last names, and neither of us know the wife's name, all right? So that's bad. And then I got to tell you the story about this house. So there's this house that's behind my house in the backyard, and I've never known who lives there. There's some trees and some shrubs that every year when it snows, I take a picture of because they look so pretty, but it blocks this house that would touch my yard in the back corner. And so I've told you about Ed Schrockman and asked you to pray for him, and he's been in hospice care lately, and not long ago I was invited to Ed's house to have a conversation with his family, and John Weiss was there, and John has done just such a beautiful job caring for Ed, and Ed's sons were there, and I knew one of Ed's sons lived in Eden Prairie, his son Brett. And so after we had some conversation with Ed, I looked at Brett, and I said, so Brett, you live in Eden Prairie. Where do you live in Eden Prairie? He says, I live over by Homeward Hills Park. I said, that's so cool. I live by Homeward Hills Park. And he says, really? He goes, like, where? And I said, well, I live up on Chestholm Lane. He goes, no way. He goes, I take a left on Chestholm Lane to get to my house, and then I go to this neighborhood behind there in Gristmill. And I said, well, my house is the one with the little free library. He goes, I walk by your house all the time. And I said, well, which house is your house on Gristmill? And he goes, it's the one that's up on a hill. You know our yards touch. He has lived in my neighborhood for the last 2 years, and we have not known that, all right? He recently went through a divorce and is living in a new house, and we've had like 5 different people live in that house over the years. And Weiss over there says to me, hey, Schulenberg, I'm never going to believe anything you say about neighbors ever again, all right? So Brett and I are becoming friends, all right? We know that where each other live now, and I absolutely love having him as a neighbor. And we've been invited to, and our schedules haven't worked out yet, to do some cookouts together and that kind of thing. See, my goal over these next 2 months is for us as a church to learn our neighbors' names. Not everybody there has the names. Some of you are like me and Jeff, and you're introverts, and even looking at this is scary. And one of the things God's convicting me about is introvert Brian. You don't get to just say, I get like a get out of loving my neighbors free card because I'm an introvert. I've called you to love your neighbors. And so I'm going to make a commitment over these next 2 months to get to know my neighbors better. Here's what I want to do. On the screen is this next stage. The names are kind of level A there. Level B is getting to know a little bit more about your neighbors. So you could maybe say, hey, my neighbors work here, or they love to do this kind of stuff, and they've got their kids are in college here or whatever. Level C is when we get to the point with our neighbors where we know about their dreams and their hopes and their fears, and we're really getting in depth with our neighbors. Next slide shows kind of a natural progression. And let's go to that one, Dave. It just says, it's more than a natural progression, right? It's really hard to love somebody if we don't know their name. How do we love someone if we don't know what their name is? And so again, step A is really easy. Step B gets a little bit difficult. So we want to move, next slide here, from being strangers with our neighbors to maybe over the next couple months, the best that we're going to be able to do is become acquaintances with some of our neighbors. And if that's kind of where you're at, that's okay. To eventually having a relationship with the neighbors that God has put in our lives. I love one of the ways that Dave Runyon, one of the authors of this book, speaks about this progression. He says it's like this. You move from a wave. Some of you, you get home, you get out of your car, and it's like you see your neighbors, and you get back into that garage, all right? That's where some of you are at. You're the wave guy. And some of you are like, I'd be doing good if I waved at my neighbors. Okay, I'm like this guy, all right? But let's try the wave, all right? And then some of you may get to like, hey, man, how you doing? You don't know their name, but you do the hey, man thing or the hey, whatever you would say thing, all right? To you learn the name, hey, Mike. And Mike is my neighbor. I love that Mike is the name that he uses in this illustration because I have 2 Mikes in my neighborhood. God is good to the introvert, all right? So, hey, Mike, hey, Mike, how you doing? which isn't the how you doing like the how you doing at church, where you say how you doing, we all say, hey, we're doing fine, and you move on, but let's let some walls fall down. Like ask how you're doing, and then stop there and actually listen and see how they're doing, to eventually get to the point where, hey, Mike, I've got this issue with my car in my garage, and I know you love working on cars. Would you be able to stop by and just take a look really quick and give me a second opinion? Got this project I'm doing, or hey, Mike, I thought we'd have like a block party this week, and we just wanted to invite you over to that party, looking for an opportunity. And then finally to, hey, Mike, I noticed your son moved back home. How's that going? How you doing with that? Filling out the block map can help off this progression of moving from stranger to acquaintance to having a relationship. Now, that's not evangelism. It's kind of pre-evangelism, all right? This is kindergarten. We're going to get to how do we practically share our faith. But you know what? Nobody wants to know about your faith if you don't love them. Nobody cares about your faith if you don't know their name. Nobody cares about the faith that you have within them if you haven't stopped and developed some relationships with the people in your neighborhood. So I want to encourage you to do that. I'm just going to close with this verse, and our worship team's going to come up. We're going to sing one more song, and then we're going to go to lunch, and we're going to have a dedication for an opportunity for us as a church to be better neighbors with this little free library. But Acts 17, 26 and 27 again. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. You've been placed in your neighborhood for a specific reason. May you love like Jesus. May you take seriously that when Jesus said we're to love our neighbors as ourselves, that he meant our actual neighbors. It's a great place to start. May God give you the courage to meet somebody that maybe you've lived next to for 10 years. And over the next 2 months, that you would develop a relationship there. I can't wait to dive deeper into this. If you want a great companion book again for where we're going in the series, this is a great one. We mentioned a couple months ago another series that is called Tell Someone. It's a free curriculum that's online, and it's a video deal that Greg Laurie, a pastor in California, has provided for anybody who's interested. And if you do a Google search, Tell Someone, it's like a 6-week class course that you can do with your family. It takes you about a half hour to watch the video and about 15 minutes to do the homework each week. And that would be a great companion to this. But just want to encourage you to think about that.